The dog didn't attack the killer, he attacked the sheriff. 1 second, the courtroom was sinking under the weight of lies. The next, blood was on the floor and truth was tearing itself free. They thought he was broken. They thought a leash and a needle would erase what he knew. But you can't unteach loyalty. You can't drug a bond built through gunfire and trust, and years of fighting side by side. They trained him to serve, they forgot to fear what happens when a good dog remembers. Tonight, a canine rose against everything he was ordered to protect. Not for revenge, not for violence, for something purer, for the truth. You're about to follow his journey through betrayal, survival, and a loyalty so fierce it shattered the system built to bury him. This isn't a story about a trial. This is the story of a dog that never forgot. If you believe truth deserves teeth, like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. In this story, trust is a battlefield, and tonight, the last soldier standing walks on 4 legs. The old courthouse stood in the heart of Charleston like a weathered titan, its stone facade bathed in the dim, flickering light of a lone street lamp. Midnight was nearing, yet the city around it seemed suspended in an eerie, breathless lull. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with something unspoken. Malik Johnson, a man whose skin was the color of deep mahogany and whose eyes bore the weight of betrayals too long endured, sat in the defendant's seat, his wrists chained lightly in front of him. Not because they thought he'd run, he wouldn't, but because it was the custom for those already condemned in the court of public opinion. The fluorescent lights above buzzed weakly, their pale light throwing harsh shadows across the courtroom's polished floors. On the opposite side of the room, a German shepherd named Rex, once Malik's partner, now sat silently beside a uniformed handler. Rex's ears twitched at every creak, every distant echo, but his body remained unnervingly still, like a sentry awaiting a signal that might never come. The judge, an aging man named Horace Whitmore, entered with a slow, deliberate stride. His robes whispered against the marble as he took his seat. Around Malik, the jury box was only half filled. Each juror handpicked for reasons Malik could smell but not prove. None of them looked like him. None of them moved like him. None of them seemed to recognize the war he'd been fighting long before he stepped into this room. His public defender, a wiry young woman named Elise Carter, leaned over, her voice a whisper beneath the oppressive silence. "Stay calm, tonight is different." Malik raised an eyebrow. Different? Different how? Wasn't every night the same since they dragged him from his home, slapped on cuffs, and stripped him of everything he'd spent a lifetime building? Elise smiled thinly and glanced toward Rex. The courtroom doors creaked open, and a man in an expensive, ill-fitting suit stepped in. Assistant District Attorney Brent Holloway, the state's new favorite puppet. He clutched a stack of files to his chest as if he feared they'd sprout wings and flee. From the back of the room, a group of journalists stirred, their pens poised like vultures ready to tear at Malik's remains. The judge banged his gavel sharply. "This court is now in session. The matter of South Carolina versus Malik Johnson." His voice was steady, but something in his tone betrayed uncertainty. No one spoke of why this session, this trial, had been moved to the witching hour. No one dared. Malik's gaze flickered to Rex again. Memories, unbidden and razor-sharp, sliced through him. Of nights they had patrolled together, of lives they had saved, of dark streets illuminated only by their faith in one another. Rex had once been more than a partner. He had been Malik's anchor in a world that often sought to drown him. But now Rex sat there like a stranger, a tool of a system that had turned its back on them both. "Call your first witness," Judge Whitmore said, and the ADA rose clumsily. "Your Honor," Holloway began, his voice thin and scratchy, "we request special dispensation to begin tonight with a non-human witness." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Malik stiffened. Elise grabbed his wrist subtly, grounding him. Rex, sensing the shift, tilted his head. Whitmore's bushy eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "Proceed," he said after a beat. Holloway cleared his throat. "We intend to demonstrate, Your Honor, that this animal, once partnered with the defendant, can corroborate elements of the case against him through trained behavioral responses." The judge looked skeptical but nodded. Holloway continued, signaling the handler. The man snapped his fingers twice and Rex stood. For a heartbeat, Malik forgot to breathe. Rex's stance was familiar, alert, precise, deadly. The handler guided Rex forward until he stood mere feet from Malik. The room held its breath. Holloway gestured broadly. The animal is trained to react to the scent and presence of individuals involved in violent crime scenes. His body language will indicate confirmation or denial of the defendant's guilt. The handler gave a soft command. Rex approached Malik's, nose twitching, muscles taut. Malik fought every instinct to reach out, to touch, to remind Rex of who he was, who they had been together, but he remained still. Rex circled him once, twice, his breath hot against Malik's skin. Then Rex sat down, but not in the submissive, accusatory way they expected. No, Rex sat back on his haunches, tail thudding softly against the floor in a rhythm Malik knew too well. It was a signal they had trained for years, target not present. The silence exploded into whispers. The handler frowned. Holloway looked as if he'd been slapped. Malik's heart pounded. Elise nails dug into his wrist in triumph. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat loudly. Order! Order! The gavel cracked again. Malik locked eyes with Rex. For a moment, just a flicker, Malik saw the old fire behind those brown eyes. Recognition, loyalty, truth. But the moment shattered. The handler yanked Rex away with unnecessary force. Malik's fists clenched until his knuckles bleached white. Elise rose from her seat, voice steady. Your Honor, I move for immediate dismissal of all charges based on the state's failure to substantiate guilt through their own key witness. Holloway stammered, The animal must be confused, it's late, he's tired, or... Elise said coolly, he remembers. The room teetered on the edge of chaos. The judge's face remained unreachable, but his fingers drummed an irregular beat on the bench. Court will recess for 20 minutes, he announced. I need time to consider. The gavel struck. Malik exhaled, a shudder of breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. As the bailiff led him from the room, Malik glanced over his shoulder one last time. Rex was staring at him, not at the handler, not at the AD, and in that look was a promise. I remember. I know. The heavy doors of the courthouse groaned open once more as Malik was led back into the room. The faint chime of his chains a discordant note against the tense silence that still lingered after the recess. The fluorescent lights overhead still buzzed in exhausted protest, but now, somewhere far beyond the walls, the clouds had shifted and allowed the cold silver of the moon to seep through the tall, narrow windows. It bathed the courtroom in a ghostly glow, painting everything in shades of uneasy blue and deep black. Malik's steps were slow but firm, his heart pounding like war drums beneath his ribs as he crossed the polished floor, eyes fixed not on the judge, not on the jurors, but on the dog that once would have broken every leash to greet him. Rex sat upright near the prosecution table, his body rigid, his nose slightly lifted as if scenting something distant, unfathomable. At first there was nothing, no recognition, no flicker of memory in those sharp eyes. Malik felt a knife twist low in his gut at the sight. The bond he thought unbreakable seemed snapped, reduced to a sterile professional performance by forces he couldn't see. Rex's handler tightened the leash slightly, oblivious to the undercurrents rippling through the room. The judge muttered something to Holloway, who was fumbling with his notes, clearly rattled by what had transpired earlier. Malik barely heard them. His focus remained, uttering and helplessly, on the dog who had once been his shadow, his brother. And Elise Carter sat back at the defense table, fingers drumming lightly, her eyes darting between Malik and Rex with something that looked perilously close to hope. Then, as Malik's footfalls drew him nearer, the moonlight, pale and almost trembling, slid fully through the window and struck Rex across his face, illuminating every scar, every fleck of gray fur, every line etched into his muzzle by battles fought side by side with Malik. It was as if the very touch of that ancient light peeled away months of training, of forced separation, of betrayal. Rex's body tensed visibly, muscles quivering under his sleek coat, his head cocked to one side, nostrils flaring. The room seemed to narrow to a single point. A taut line stretched between man and beast. For a heartbeat, the world balanced precariously. Then Rex whimpered. It was soft, barely audible beneath the buzzing lights, but it was real. A choked, desperate sound Malik had not heard since their first mission together, when a shell had exploded too close, and a younger, less hardened Rex had pressed his trembling body against Malik's side. The handler stiffened, jerking the leash, whispering sharp commands under his breath, trying to pull Rex back to discipline, to silence, to submission. But it was too late. Something old and unbreakable had reawakened. Malik stood frozen, a storm of emotion battering his ribs. But he did not move toward Rex. He didn't dare. His restraint was a blade cutting his palms, but he knew better. To reach would break whatever fragile, flickering thing had just been rekindled between them. Instead, he locked eyes with Rex, steady, unwavering, the way he had done 1,000 times on rooftops, in alleys, on blood-soaked fields where only their bond had separated life from death. Rex whined again, louder now, drawing the attention of the judge and the jurors. Holloway slammed a palm on the table, trying to reclaim control. "Order! Restrain the animal," he barked, his voice cracked. The handler yanked Rex back sharply, dragging him down into a sit. The German shepherd obeyed, but reluctantly, his eyes never leaving Malik's. For a moment longer, the courtroom vibrated with the held breath of everyone present. Then, slowly, the mood slipped behind another veil of cloud, and the silver illumination faded, returning the room to its sterile, artificial light. Rex blinked as if waking from a dream, his body sagging slightly, confusion rippling through his posture. Holloway seized the moment. "Your Honor," he called out, "this is exactly why animal testimony must be considered unreliable. We can hardly proceed based on the whims of a confused dog." But the judge was no fool. He watched Rex thoughtfully, drumming his fingers on the bench once more. Elise leaned in toward Malik and whispered, "It's working, just hold on." Malik nodded almost imperceptibly. Yet just as the room threatened to descend back into routine courtroom tedium, a sound that stopped every heart, raised every hair, and cracked the fragile veneer of order. Rex howled. Not a bark, not a whimper, a full-bodied, ancient, soul-wrenching howl that echoed against the wood and marble and glass, like a mourning song for a fallen comrade. The jurors recoiled, some covering their ears, others keeping startled glances at one another. The bailiffs jumped to their feet. The judge stood, his mouth opening in disbelief. But Rex wasn't howling at Malik, he wasn't howling at the handler. His head turned, slow and deliberate, his powerful chest swelling with his voice. His gaze locked, unwavering, onto a single juror, seat number 7. A middle-aged man with sandy hair, a neat navy suit, and a gold watch that flashed under the courtroom lights. The man went pale instantly, his hands clenching into fists on his lap. His jaw worked soundlessly as Rex's howls seemed to point at him like an arrow tipped with judgment. Elise straightened sharply. Malik's pulse thundered in his ears. The handler shouted more commands, but Rex refused to break his focus. His entire body was trembling now, hackles raised, teeth bared not in aggression but in desperate insistence. The bailiffs hesitated, caught between protocol and primal fear. C7, Malik stared at the man, memorizing every detail, every twitch of guilt that played across his features. There was something there, something hidden, something Rex remembered. Across the room, Holloway barked, "Remove the dog, restrain him now." But it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted, watered by moonlight and blood and memory. The courtroom had seen, the courtroom had heard, and even if they could drag Rex away, even if they silenced him, the wound he had torn open would not be so easily stitched shut. The judge pounded his gavel once more, shouting for order, but the sound was muffled under the ragged, defiant crescendo of Rex's final howl before the bailiffs finally surged forward to seize him. Malik stood utterly still, heart hammering, breath shallow. In that moment he understood. This wasn't about guilt or innocence in the eyes of men. It was about something older, something deeper. Rex had seen a truth they dared not name, a truth that Malik had only begun to glimpse beneath the surface of whispered deals and midnight trials. As the bailiffs wrestled Rex toward the exit, Malik turned his gaze toward Juror 7, locking eyes for the briefest second, seeing the crack spiderweb across the man's carefully neutral facade. And somewhere, in that shattering instant, Malik knew that the real trial hadn't even begun yet. The courtroom walls seemed to shrink inward as Rex's last, raw howl dissolved into a stunned, terrified silence, broken only by the distant click of bootsteps and the frantic scratching of pen on paper as the journalists tried to capture the chaos unfolding before them. Malik stood rigid as the bailiffs finally wrestled Rex out of the room. The dog's eyes locked onto him until the last possible second, burning with a desperate warning he could not yet fully understand, his face unnaturally pale under the strained lights. Barked for order with a voice hoarse from disuse. But the damage was already done. The jurors shifted in their seats, glancing nervously at seat number 7, the sandy-haired man who now sat stiffly, his face an unhealthy shade of gray, hands clenched so tightly that the knuckles gleamed white under the courtroom's sterile lighting. Elise leaned closer to Malik, her voice a taut whisper. Malik nodded once, his mind racing, the pieces beginning to form an outline of something vast and rotting just beneath the surface. It wasn't just about this trial, this courtroom, or even the murder he was accused of. It was about something far older, far dirtier, something that stank of corruption fermented over years. Caleb waited until the session was adjourned until morning. Under the excuse of extraordinary circumstances, Malik was led back down the echoing halls of the courthouse, the cuffs biting into his wrists a little deeper with every step. The bailiff escorting him was younger than most, his face tight with something that might have been sympathy or might have been fear. Malik didn't ask which, he simply walked cataloging every crack in the floor, every shadow in the hallway, because survival, real survival, came from never missing the details, and the details might be the only thing keeping him alive. When they reached the holding cells beneath the courthouse, the bailiff hesitated, then leaned close under the dim bulb of the intake desk. "You didn't hear it from me," he muttered, shoving a folded slip of paper into Malik's hand before shackling him to the bench, and walking away fast enough to leave a suspicion behind him. Malik waited until he was alone, the ancient buzz of the fluorescents the only sound, then carefully unfolded the paper beneath the bench. The handwriting was messy, urgent, half-struck. Malik's stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. The memories crashed back in waves. 2 years ago, the night he was suspended without cause. A night soaked in betrayal and disbelief. The night he had stumbled across a file he wasn't supposed to see. A file that mapped a network of dirty cops moving guns and drugs through Charleston's poorest neighborhoods. A network protected and enforced by men in blue. A network he had threatened to expose before they shut him down, discredited him, smeared his name, and threw him to the wolves. And now it made sense why they needed Rex, why they had pulled his partner into this charade. Because there had been a backup, a failsafe, something only Rex could help retrieve. The recording, a file Malik himself had trained Rex to identify and signal on command. A piece of evidence small enough to hide, dangerous enough to kill, for Malik's throat went dry. Had the recorder survived? Had it made it to evidence 4A? Or had it conveniently disappeared, like so many inconvenient truths before it? Across the room, a guard glanced up suspiciously, and Malik stuffed the note back into his pocket, assuming the slatch-jawed expression of a man who had given up. But inside, his mind was sharpening to a blade's edge. They thought they had buried him under false charges. They thought they had broken the bond between him and Rex. But they had miscalculated. Badly. Because now Malik had seen the fear in Juror 7's eyes, had heard Rex's mournful accusation echo off the walls, and now he knew the rot ran deeper than he'd imagined. And the real evidence, the key to blowing the whole thing apart, had been within their grasp all along. Hours later, back in his cell, Malik lay flat on the cot, staring up at the cracked ceiling as the moonlight filtered through the barred window high above. Elise had visited briefly, whispered updates through the slot in the door, her face grim, her words urgent. "They're," she warned, "tampering, threatening witnesses, burying anything that could link back to them. And Rex, they're talking about having him transferred to a federal holding facility tomorrow. Once he's out of reach, it's over." Malik's jaw tightened so hard it ached. They were erasing the witnesses, erasing the evidence, erasing him, unless he found a way to expose it first. Somewhere out there, evidence 4A had either been destroyed or hidden. And if Malik was right, someone inside the courthouse still had access to it. Someone nervous enough to panic under pressure. Someone connected to the sandy-hazed man in seat number 7. The recorder was the thread, and if he could pull it, everything could unravel. But first he had to survive the night, survive the guards, survive the silence pressing against his skull like a loaded gun, and pray that Elise could get him the opportunity he needed before the noose tightened completely around his neck. Midnight ticked past again, another day lost, another thread pulled loose from the tapestry of Malik's life. But somewhere far away, in the depths of the evidence archives, behind locked doors and falsified records, a small silver recorder waited, forgotten by some, feared by others, a tiny relic of a night when loyalty had not yet been for sale, and justice still had a fighting chance. Malik closed his eyes against the weight of exhaustion, feeling Rex's howl echo through his chest once more, vibrating with urgency, with sorrow, with rage. Tomorrow, he would rip open the walls they had built around the truth with his bare hands if he had to. Tomorrow, he would hunt the men who had engineered his fall. Tomorrow, he would find evidence for or he would die trying. The morning dragged its cold light over Charleston like a reluctant confession, spilling through barred windows and pooling against the scuffed floors of the courthouse as Malik was led back upstairs, wrists shackled, mind razor-sharp under the exhaustion that gnawed at the edges of his vision. Elise was already waiting at the defense table, her face drawn but alert, her fingers tapping rapid tattoo against her legal pad. She barely looked at him as she whispered under her breath, "They moved Rex last night to a secure kennel inside courthouse grounds. He's close, but they've locked down all access, no visitors, no handlers except for department insiders." Malik nodded grimly, absorbing the new complication, but also the opportunity it presented. Because if Rex was nearby, then so was the scent, the memory, the key they hadn't realized they needed yet. The courtroom filled slowly, dragging a heavy fog of tension behind every juror, every lawyer, every clerk. The air crackled with something unsaid but alive, growing, swelling like a storm held barely in check. Judge Whitmore entered with his usual weary authority, but there was something brittle about him now, as if he too sensed the ground shifting beneath their feet. Holloway sat rigidly at the prosecution tables, despite the chill in the room, and when Malik's gaze swept the jury box, he saw that seat number 7, the sandy-haired man, refused to meet his eyes. His hands fidgeted endlessly, fingers twitching against his slacks as if trying to wipe away invisible blood. Malik's heart hammered a slow, brutal rhythm against his ribs as the bailiff announced the day's first order of business. The testimony of Sergeant Aaron Briggs, former K-9 officer and Malik's one-time partner before politics and betrayal had carved a jagged chasm between them. Briggs, a man who had once fought beside him, who had once sworn loyalty deeper than blood, was scheduled to testify about departmental procedures and Malik's alleged from protocol that, according to the prosecution's narrative, had led him down the road to murder. But Malik knew something Holloway didn't, something Elise had confirmed in a whisper last night. Briggs had been present the night Malik stumbled onto the dirty evidence room, the night everything began to fall apart. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a low murmur spread across the benches like wildfire. Heads turned, whispers bloomed, but there was no Sergeant Briggs walking down the aisle. Instead, Captain Lawrence, the stiff, humorless officer in charge of courthouse security, strode grim-faced to the judge's bench, handed him a hastily scrawled note. Judge Whitmore read it once, twice, her hand tightening around the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened. Whitmore cleared his throat, his voice cracking despite the microphone. "It is with deep regret that I inform the court that Sergeant Aaron Briggs was found deceased early this morning in his home, apparent suicide." The room erupted in noise, gasps, shouts, the metallic scrape of chairs shifting violently against tile. Even Holloway looked momentarily shaken, his mouth opening and closing like a man who had just seen the noose meant for someone else swing empty in the wind. Malik sat still, a glacier of fury freezing every nerve ending in his body. Briggs had been silenced, just like the evidence file, just like Malik's reputation, and whoever had ordered it wasn't finished yet. Elise recovered first, rising to her feet with the cold precision of a surgeon. "Your Honor," she said, her voice slicing through the din, "given the sudden death of a key witness for the prosecution and the highly suspicious circumstances surrounding said death, we renew our motion to dismiss all charges immediately, pending full internal investigation." Holloway stumbled to his feet, sputtering, "Objection! Pure speculation, no connection to the case." But the judge was no longer looking at either lawyer. His eyes were distant, troubled, as if he too was counting the bodies piling up around a truth he didn't dare name. Before he could rule, the bailiff leaned in, whispering urgently, and for the second time that day Whitmore paled visibly. "Another development," he said heavily. "Last night there was an attempted break-in at the evidence archive, Wing 4A, no items reported missing. Yet..." Malik's heart kicked against his chest so hard it made his head swim. The recorder, the damn recorder, someone had almost succeeded. The judge sagged in his chair, massaging his temples, then waved them onward with a tired hand. "Proceed with your next witness." Holloway fumbled with his notes, visibly rattled, and called a name Malik hadn't heard in months. Officer Jared Pike. Another ghost from his past, another man who had worn the same badge, the same uniform, the same hollow mask. Pike slouched into the room, all faux bravado and darted guilty eyes. He swore his oath with a twitching hand, then sank into the witness box like a man hoping the floor would swallow him before the questions began. As Elise cross-examined Pike with surgical ruthlessness, Malik's attention drifted to the far corner of the courtroom, where a narrow service hallway disappeared into the bowels of the courthouse. Somewhere down that hall, Rex sat alone, waiting, guarding secrets no human mouth could yet confess. Malik remembered every drill, every exercise they had run, where Rex had been trained not just to detect explosives or drugs, but to identify scents attached to specific objects, specific individuals, through layers of cloth, concrete, and fear. Rex remembered, and Malik realized with sudden, blinding clarity, it wasn't just training, wasn't just habit. Rex had howled at Juror 7 because he recognized something deeper, something embedded at the molecular level. The scent of betrayal, the scent of blood, the scent of a killer standing smug and safe within the sanctity of a jury box. Malik's possess clenched at the thought, the raw injustice of it, the obscenity of that man sitting in judgment over him while Briggs lay dead, and evidence lay rotting in a sealed locker downstairs. As Pike stumbled through another lie under Elise's icy interrogation, Malik knew with chilling certainty that time was running out. Rex was the last thread he had left, and the forces closing in on him both would not hesitate to sever it. One way or another, the tension in the courtroom had thickened to the point of suffocation by midday, the stagnant air tasting of sweat, ink, and something sourer, something born of fear and desperation. Malik sat motionless, eyes narrowed, tracking every tick, every whisper, every glance exchanged between the prosecution table and the bailiffs, clustered uneasily at the edges of the room. Elise continued her relentless assault against Pike's crumbling testimony, but Malik's mind worked feverishly behind the mask of calm, assembling the puzzle pieces faster now. The break-in at Evidence 4A, Briggs's suicide, the juror Rex had howled at. It was all part of the same dying constellation, each star a warning that time was bleeding away faster than he could staunch it. When the judge finally called for an early recess, citing health and procedural concerns, Malik felt a tremor of urgency he could not ignore. Elise leaned in close as the courtroom emptied around them, her voice little more than a breath against his ear. "I pulled the internal logs," she said, sliding a crumpled printout under his chained hands. Malik scanned the paper, his blood running cold. According to courthouse security records, every security camera in Wing C, the archive wing housing Evidence 4A, had gone dark for precisely 94 minutes during the night of the break-in. No alarm triggered, no alert sounded, just a smooth, professional blackout, timed almost perfectly with Rex's sudden relocation to a secure holding area. Malik's fingers tightened around the paper until it crinkled, because 94 minutes was more than enough time to move evidence, to falsify chain of custody records, to stage a transfer that would leave no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no chance of appeal. Elise's eyes burned into him, sharp and furious. Malik nodded grimly, but his mind snagged on a deeper worry, one rooted in the way Rex had behaved the night before. Not just the howling, but the hesitation, the confusion when the moonlight faded, the way he had sagged under commands he would have once executed with lethal precision. Something was wrong, something beyond separation and stress, something deliberate. As Malik was escorted back toward his holding cell, he feigned a stumble, crashing hard into a passing guard and muttering an apology as he righted himself. In the confusion, he managed to snag a glimpse of a clipboard tucked under the man's arm. A clipboard labeled K9 Medical. A surge of adrenaline lit Malik's veins as he caught a partial glimpse of a document underneath a veterinary authorization slip dated 2 nights ago, countersigned by Holloway himself, referencing behavioral stabilization injections. Malik's mouth went dry. They had drugged Rex, not for health, not for safety, but to undermine him, to blunt his instincts, to disrupt his sensory balance at critical moments. The pieces fell together with horrifying clarity. Behavioral stabilization was bureaucrat jargon masking the administration of sedatives and neurochemical agents designed to disorient without completely incapacitating. Agents that, under normal circumstances, left no permanent trace unless specifically tested for within hours of injection. And under intense lighting conditions, the kind found in sterile courtrooms under flickering fluorescence, the symptoms would be amplified. Malik's fists clenched so hard his cuffs bit into his skin. They hadn't just caged his partner. They had broken the unspoken contract between them, poisoned the trust built through blood and fire for the sake of a manufactured conviction. Back in his cell, Malik paced, the small space feeling more like a coffin with each passing hour. He had no proof yet, nothing admissible, but the timeline was undeniable. First the camera's cut, then Rex is sedated, then the archive wing is compromised, all cloaked under the cover of night when oversight evaporated and shadows ruled. Malik's rage was a living thing inside him, coiling tighter, hotter, with every second, but rage without strategy was suicide. And if Malik had learned anything in his years crawling through the underbelly of Charleston's dirtiest alleys, it was that survival depended not on fury, but on precision. As evening crept in, bleeding gold and crimson through the courthouse's narrow windows, Malik sat with his back against the cold concrete wall, mind racing, every instinct screaming that the next move had to be his, or he would be buried along with the last fragments of truth. When the guard came for him, rattling his keys against the bars, Malik sat slowly, schooling his features into blankness. Outside the courtroom, Elise met him with a look that was all steel and calculation. She said simply, "We finish this, or we don't walk out at all." Malik gave a single nod, accepting the unspoken pact between them. The nighttime session had been called hastily, almost desperately, an emergency motion filed by Holloway to introduce new evidence, allegedly salvaged from the damaged security system, a last-ditch maneuver that reeked of panic. Malik walked back into the courtroom under the buzz of dying lights. Every shadow too long, every whisper too sharp. The jury reassembled with the slow dread of soldiers marching into an ambush. Seat number 7 looked even worse than before, his hands trembling visibly now, his skin waxen under the fluorescent glare. Judge Whitmore entered last, his face ashen, his robe hanging off him like a shroud. Holloway rose to address the court, his words slick but hollow, announcing that during routine forensic checks, a corrupted security backup had been discovered, allegedly confirming Malik's unauthorized presence in restricted evidence rooms. Elise objected immediately, demanding chain of custody authentication, metadata verification, setting a hearing for the next morning, delaying final judgment, but not erasing the stench of the trap closing around them. Malik sat back, letting the courtroom drama unfold around him like a slow Mattel Enclave car crash, his gaze flickering to the rear entrance, where the bailiffs had just rolled in a small kennel, a battered plastic thing with a scratched brass plate. K91 Rex. Malik's heart twisted at the sight, because this was the fulcrum upon which everything now balanced. Tonight, under this corrupted light, with cameras sabotaged and Rex drugged, and friends dying by their own hand or someone else's, Malik would have one last chance to reach him, to awaken the warrior sleeping beneath the haze of betrayal. And somewhere, buried beneath the weight of sedatives and commands, Malik knew Rex was still there, still fighting, still remembering. Because memory, real memory, was not so easily erased. It lived in the blood, in the bone, in the breath between heartbeats, waiting for the right moment to ignite. The courtroom's fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered overhead, like dying insects as Malik sat shackled to the defense table, the kennel containing Rex resting heavily against the side wall. Elise whispered strategies and contingency plans under her breath, but Malik only half heard her. His pulse was a relentless drum against his ribs, his gaze fixed on the inert shape of his old partner who now sat unnaturally still inside the plastic prison, his body posture stiff, movements sluggish, the sedative still muting his instincts as Holloway blustered and filibustered to the judge about chain of evidence and public safety. Malik's hope thinned to a fragile wire, ready to snap. His fingers twitched against the chains binding his wrists. He clenched them into fists to hide the tremor of despair creeping up from his gut. As the arguments dragged on and the night pressed heavier against the courthouse walls, a commotion stirred near the rear holding cells. Muffled voices, the scrape of boots against tile. Malik turned his head subtly, catching sight of an old man in a faded gray uniform shuffling toward him. A corrections officer from another era, his face lined like old leather, eyes sharp despite the sagging weariness of age. The man lingered near Malik's side under the pretense of adjusting the shackles. His hands swift and practiced, and just as quickly he pressed a small object into Malik's palm. Malik closed his fingers reflexively around it, feeling the hard plastic ridges of a USB drive against his skin. The old man didn't look at him, didn't speak, only Malik could hear, "Proof they can't erase, son, you better move fast." And then he shuffled away, disappearing into the maze of corridors before any of the bailiffs could notice. Malik's heart thundered in his ears. He slipped the USB into the lining of his jumpsuit just as Elise turned toward him, her eyes widening slightly at the subtle exchange. But she said nothing, simply resumed arguing with Holloway as if nothing had happened. Malik's mind raced. What was on it? How could he access it? Would it even be admissible? But instinct, honed sharper than any courtroom training, told him that whatever the old man had risked to pass to him was important, possibly everything. Minutes later, Elise managed to maneuver a break in the arguments by demanding a brief recess to consult on procedural anomalies. Malik was led roughly back toward the side corridor, away from the main courtroom, two bailiffs flanking him, and just as they passed a supply closet, Elise dropped her binder, papers scattering theatrically across the floor. The guards groaned, irritated, and bent to help gather them. Malik seized the moment, slipping into the closet and yanking the door almost closed behind him. Inside the darkness, Malik fumbled with the USB, his fingers slick with sweat, found a battered laptop abandoned on a maintenance shelf likely used for inventory, and jammed the drive into the port. The screen flickered. A file directory blinked into existence, a single video file labeled only with the date from over a year ago, heart hammering. Malik opened it. The grainy footage began to play. A training session, the kind held off-record, late at night, when the department was teaching K-9 units to respond to specific high-risk scents and profiles. And there he was. Rex, younger, unbroken, sharp as a blade, locked onto a scent line run by none other than juror number 7. The sandy-haired man who now sat trembling on the jury bench. The video showed Rex giving a full, aggressive alert, the signal for identifying a high-value threat without hesitation, without confusion. Malik's breath caught in his throat, the implications crashing over him like a tidal wave. Not only was the juror compromised, he had been tagged by Rex in an official capacity long before this trial, a fact that had been buried, erased from every report, every testimony. But here, captured forever in digital memory, was proof of a connection so damning it could implode the entire case against Malik and shatter the credibility of the prosecution's key jury. Elise burst into the closet a moment later, slamming the door behind her, her chest heaving, her face alight with fierce urgency. "What did you find?" she demanded. Malik showed her the footage, their heads bent together over the tiny glowing screen, her lips pressed into a grim, determined line as she watched. "We can use this," she said, "but we have to act now. If we wait, they'll bury this too." Together they slipped back into the courtroom, Malik hiding the laptop under his arm as Elise addressed the judge during the newly convened session. "Your Honor," she said loudly enough to cut through the restless murmuring of the courtroom, "we have newly discovered exculpatory evidence that demands immediate review before any further proceedings." Holloway surged to his feet in protest, blustering about admissibility and protocol. But Judge Whitmore, looking every second of his 70 years, held up a weary hand. "Bring it forward," he commanded. Elise connected the laptop to the courtroom's central projector, Malik's pulse hammering in his temples as the loading bar crawled across the screen. The lights above flickered again, stuttering as if protesting the very truth they were about to reveal. Then the footage began to play. Rex charging forward, the sandy-haired man recoiling, the unmistakable posture of a dog trained to identify danger in its purest, most immediate form. And then, just as Rex barked in full alert on the screen, the entire courthouse shuddered as the lights died with a brutal snap, plunging everything into absolute darkness. The room erupted into chaos, the sudden loss of light triggering screams, shouts, the scrape of chairs, and the panicked shuffle of feet against marble. Malik froze, forcing himself to stay rooted as instinct screamed at him to run, to fight, to survive. He counted each second in the dark, the suffocating black lights stretching on and on. No emergency lights, no backup generators. Only the sound of confusion and terror filling the space where order had once lived. 17 seconds later, with a painful flicker, the lights stuttered back to life, sickly and uneven, throwing the courtroom into a patchwork of sharp shadows and blinding glares. The laptop was gone, the USB ripped from the port, the video feed dead, a blank blue screen humming uselessly in its place. And across the room, Malik's eyes locked onto the last person he ever expected to see standing by the evidence table. Something glinting in his hand, a figure he knew too well, a betrayal he hadn't even allowed himself to imagine yet. The courtroom was still reeling from the blackout when the tension snapped like a whip. Malik's breath came in short, tight bursts as he scanned the chaos, eyes darting between the jurors who cowered in their seats and the uniformed officers who fumbled uselessly with their radios. Holloway stood rigid beside the prosecution table, veins bulging at his neck as he shouted incoherent orders that no one seemed to hear. And in the midst of the confusion, one figure moved too smoothly, too deliberately. A man in a dark gray suit who had been sitting at the back of the room during most of the trial, unnoticed, unremarked upon. A man who now clutched something metallic in his gloved hand as he slipped toward the side exit. Malik's instincts flared like a struck match, and, before he could shout a warning, the battered plastic kennel at the side wall exploded into motion. Rex, his body a blur of unleashed fury and muscle memory, smashed through the flimsy door of his cage with a snarl that split the thick air like a blade, his paws skidding once against the polished floor before finding traction. His nose lifted high, his body zeroing in not on Malik, not on the Sandy Hagerer, but on the man in gray moving fast toward the emergency exit. For a fraction of a second, time seemed to the jurors ducking instinctively, the gray-suited man's hand tightening around whatever he carried as he broke into a run, and then Rex launched. The impact was thunderous, a collision of pure momentum and raw precision. Rex slammed into the man's side with the full force of his trained body, knocking him sideways into the wall with a heavy thud that rattled the frames of the courtroom's solemn paintings. The man grunted, the object in his hand a flash drive identical to the one Malik had received clattering to the floor and skittering under a bench. Rex didn't give him time to recover. The German Shepherd's jaws clamped onto the man's forearm with terrifying strength, dragging him down, pinning him with a series of savage, controlled jerks, designed to disable without killing. The room froze, everyone staring in stunned horror at the spectacle of the trained canine assaulting a supposed civilian witness. Holloway screamed for the officers to intervene, but nobody moved. No one dared approach the dog, not when Rex was operating under deep instinct, not when the smell of guilt and danger bled from the pinned man's pores like a tangible cloud. Malik pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the shouts to stay down, his heart hammering in his ears as he strode across the floor, the guards hesitating just long enough for him to reach them, to crouch beside Rex, to see clearly for the first time the face of the man the dog had brought down. It wasn't just a civilian, wasn't just some plant or minor official. It was Sheriff Douglas Warden, head of Charleston County Law Enforcement, Malik's former commanding officer, the man who had smiled and clapped him on the back the night of his commendation ceremony. The man who had signed his suspension papers with the same hand that now struggled uselessly against Rex's iron grip. Malik's vision narrowed into a tunnel, the world receding until all he could see was Warden's blood-drained face and the trembling in his eyes. The sheriff opened his mouth to protest, to spin, to lie, but Malik's voice cut him off, low and shaking with the force of years buried alive. "How long, Doug?" he asked. "How long have you been selling us out?" Warden didn't answer. Couldn't answer, because Rex gave a low warning growl that made the entire bench nearest them flinch. Elise was at Malik's side a second later, her face pale but triumphant, She grabbed the fallen flash drive and tucked it into her jacket without hesitation, her other hand already pulling out her phone to demand an emergency audit of the building's entire security feed. Melise heard the judge shouting for order, heard Holloway stammer trying to salvage the sinking wreck of his case. But it was too late. The dominoes were falling faster than anyone could stop them now. Across the room, the sandy-haired juror had slumped fully in his chair, his hands covering his face, his body racked with silent sobs. A man who knew that the walls of lies he had been hiding behind were crumbling faster than he could patch them. Malik rose slowly, placing a steady hand on Rex's head, feeling the taut quiver of restrained violence still coiled in the dog's body. Rex was trembling not with rage but with the effort it took to hold back, to obey even now, after everything they had done to him. The deputy bailiffs finally moved, guns half drawn but trembling. Malik held up a hand. "Don't," he said, his voice carrying through the silence like a commandment. "He'd done what you couldn't." For a long moment, no one moved. And then one by one the guards lowered their weapons. One by one the bystanders realized that the man lying pinned and bleeding on the floor was not the victim but the architect of the nightmare that had brought them all here. Sheriff Warden tried one last time to speak, his voice a broken rasp. "You don't understand, Malik. You don't know what's at stake." But Malik cut him off with a look, because he did understand now. Understood more than Warden could ever imagine. Understood that this wasn't just about a single trial or a single betrayal. It was about a system rotted from the inside out. A system that had fed on loyalty and bled dry every ounce of decency left in men like Warden. And standing above him, Malik realized that the only reason he had survived, the only reason he still breathed, was because one battered, drugged, almost broken dog had refused to forget who his true enemy was. But as the realization crystallized in Malik's mind, a new noise sliced through the thick, choking air of the courtroom. A sound that raised the hair on the back of his neck and sent a fresh bolt of adrenaline screaming through his blood. Because someone else was moving now, someone slipping through the gathering throng toward the bench where Elise had tucked the stolen flash drive. A shadow that had been waiting for just the right moment to strike. The figure lunged from the crowd with terrifying speed, a flash of silver glinting in their hand. Malik barely had time to react before instinct, raw and unthinking, propelled him forward. Rex moved even faster, a blur of tan and black muscle hurling itself between Malik and the threat with the single-minded devotion that only death could deny. The gunshot cracked through the courtroom like the breaking of the world, a sharp, hideous sound that drowned out the shouts, the screams, and the pounding footsteps. Malik felt the burn of displaced air as the bullet sliced past him, then the sickening thud of impact, and then the world slowed, freezing into jagged frames. Rex staggering sideways, a dark stain blossoming across the fur of his shoulder. The massive dog collapsing to the polished floor, with a whimper that shattered Malik's heart into pieces too small to ever be mended. The shooter, a second bailiff whose face twisted in horror the moment the shot left his weapon, was tackled by a swarm of officers before he could fire again. Holloway screamed something about protecting the court. Elise shouted back that it was attempted murder. Chaos unfurled around them in wild spirals, but Malik could see nothing except Rex lying motionless at his feet. Malik dropped to his knees, ripping off the chains at his wrists with savage yanks until the thin skin tore and bled, hands trembling as he pressed against Rex's wound. Blood hot and slick against his palms. "Stay with me, buddy, stay," Maddie whispered, his voice breaking into shards. "You're not done yet, you hear me? You're not done." But Rex's eyes, so fierce even under sedation, now fluttered weakly, his chest heaving in shallow, pained gasps. Elise knelt beside them, her face pale, her hands moving quickly to apply pressure. But Malik knew the wound was bad, too much blood, too fast. And even if they called an ambulance now, even if they cleared the way, Rex had stood between Malik and death one last time, and now Malik had to make a choice, one that carved through him deeper than any knife, deeper than any betrayal. He looked around the courtroom at the faces staring at him, some in guilt, some still too blind to see, and he knew in that moment that the system would never let them both walk free, not after what had been exposed, not after the lies unraveling in front of everyone's eyes. Malik squeezed his eyes shut against the flood of rage, grief, and helplessness surging through him. Then he rose slowly, hands slick with Rex's blood, and turned to Judge Whitmore. the room falling deathly silent as he spoke. "Your Honor," he said, his voice hoarse but unwavering. "I'm ready to plead guilty." Elise snapped her head toward him, her mouth opening to protest, but Malik cut her off with a glance that brokered no argument. Holloway seized the opportunity like a drowning man, shouting for immediate recording of the plea, immediate sentencing, anything to close the wound before it bled the whole system dry. Judge Whitmore hesitated, his lined face racked with something that might have been shame, might have been weariness, but ultimately he nodded, signaling the clerk to prepare the necessary documents. Malik crossed the floor on legs that felt hollow, each step echoing louder than the last. He knew what he was doing, knew that confessing now would bury any chance of real justice. But it was the only way to save Rex, the only way to ensure that his partner, his brother, wouldn't be euthanized as an aggressive liability by the very system that had drugged and betrayed him. As Malik stood before the bench, he said the words that would seal his fate, each syllable like razors against his throat. "I plead guilty to obstruction of justice," he said. "I accept responsibility for mishandling evidence and misconduct during my service." Holloway smirked triumphantly. Elise stood frozen, fists clenched at her sides. But Malik didn't look at them, didn't look at the jurors or the watching reporters. He looked only at Rex, who lay watching him with glassy, struggling eyes, as if somehow understanding the sacrifice being made. The judge's gavel came down with a hollow crack, sentencing Malik to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A formality wrapped in the trappings of solemnity. Malik barely heard it, his ears ringing with the roar of blood and the fading heartbeat he could feel beneath his hands where they pressed against Rex's wound. A medic team rushed in finally, lifting Rex onto a stretcher. Working quickly but carefully, Malik moved with them automatically, ignoring the bailiffs shouting for him to return to the prisoner's dock, ignoring the chains rattling at his feet. Elise was arguing furiously with the judge now, citing judicial misconduct, gross negligence, pleading for a stay of sentence. But Malik knew it was too late for him. All that Rex had a chance, a sliver of hope carved out of Malik's surrender. They pushed the stretcher down the hall, fluorescent lights flickering overhead, the smell of antiseptic already filling Malik's nose, a smell he had come to associate with endings, with final goodbyes. He walked beside Rex, whispering to him through gritted teeth, "You're gonna make it, buddy. You're gonna make it. You're stronger than all of them." And he saw Rex's ear twitch, saw the faintest thump of his tail against the stretcher, the smallest, most stubborn flicker of life refusing to be extinguished. As they reached the emergency exit, the doors burst open, and a rush of cool night air hit Malik like a slap, clearing the suffocating fog from his mind just long enough to realize that someone was already waiting outside. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Someone who carried the heavy, unmistakable shape of a weapon under their jacket. The night air was a slap of reality against Malik's fevered mind. As he stood frozen by the ambulance doors, Rex strapped securely to the gurney inside, medics working frantically to stabilize him, and just beyond the edge of the parking lot's broken lights, a figure stood waiting, shadowed but unmistakably armed. Rex powered, preparing to throw himself over Rex if he had to, when a small voice cut through the tense air. Fragile but steady, Malik's head snapped toward the sound, his body taut with adrenaline. But it wasn't another officer or assassin standing there. It was a little girl, maybe 12 years old, thin as a reed, her hair tied back in 2 trembling braids. She clutched something tightly to her chest, something wrapped in faded brown paper, her wide eyes locked onto Malik's with a fierce, desperate light that seemed too old for her young face. The armed man behind her stepped forward, not raised in threat but in silent identification. He was a private investigator, not an enemy, and the girl was holding out the package to Malik with shaking hands. Malik hesitated, his instincts torn between a dozen threats, but something in the way the girl stood there, refusing to flinch, refusing to back down, forced him to move. He crossed the cracked pavement in 3 long strides, dropping to one knee so he could look her directly in the eye. "Who sent you?" he asked hoarsely, and the girl's chin lifted with trembling pride. Her voice cracked, but she didn't cry, didn't break. She simply thrust the package into Malik's hands with a strength born of sheer necessity. He said, "You're the only one who could make it right." Malik tore the paper away with fumbling fingers, revealing a stained envelope and a worn flash drive. The envelope was addressed in a shaky hand. The words hit him like body blows. One after another, the letter was a confession. A full and damning account from the father of the girl, a former accountant for the Charleston County Sheriff's Department, a man who had uncovered the network of corruption Malik had stumbled upon, but instead of blowing the whistle, he had been blackmailed into silence. And when he finally tried to expose what he knew, he had been framed, his death made to look like an accident, the guilt of his inaction crushing him, until he had decided to leave this world, but not without ensuring the truth had a chance to survive. Malik's hands shook as he read the final lines. A plea for forgiveness, a hope that someone brave enough would finish the fight he could not. Elise appeared at his side, breathless, her eyes scanning the letter as Malik passed it to her. Then moving to the flash drive, her fingers flying over the small laptop she carried in her satchel. Files opened, images loaded, recordings crackled to life, all documenting secret meetings, payoff ledgers, communications between Warden and Holloway arranging Malik's frame-up, falsified evidence logs, the tampering with Rex's training record, even video snippets showing the real killer Juror 7 accepting cash payments under the table weeks before Malik's trial ever began. It was all there, every sordid, damning piece, laid out in cold, irrefutable fact. For a moment, Malik couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stare as the entire machinery of lies and betrayal laid itself bare before him. He felt Elise's hand on his arm, grounding him, steadying him. "We have to get this into the record," she said urgently, "before they can shut it down." Malik nodded, already moving, already calculating, already burning with the knowledge that the truth was no longer a whisper in the dark, it was a blade he could finally wield. They stormed back into the courthouse, ignoring the shouted orders to halt, ignoring the hands reaching to seize them, bursting into the main courtroom where the chaos had only half settled. Judge Whitmore was conferring in hushed tones with two bailiffs. Warden sat slumped in shackles, pale and sweating, and Holloway paced like a caged wolf near the prosecution table, his eyes snapping up as Malik and Elise barreled through the double doors, the girl trailing close, clutching the brown paper scrap like a lifeline. "Your Honor," Elise called, her voice slicing through the din like a blade. "We have new evidence, irrefutable, exculpatory, and damn it." She slapped the flash drive down on the evidence table with a sharp crack that silenced even Holloway. Judge Whitmore looked up, his expression guarded, skeptical, but Malik could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of months, years perhaps, of seeing justice perverted, and being too afraid or too compromised to stop it. The drive was loaded into the court's primary system, projected onto the huge screen behind the bench, and the images that filled it sucked every last breath from the room. Corruption, conspiracy, murder, all wrapped up in neat, brutal clarity. Holloway sputtered, tried to object, but Whitmore cut him off with a single, upraised hand. The judge's mouth tightened into a grim line as he read, listened, absorbed. When it was finished, when the last recording played, the one where Warden's voice casually discussed removing Johnson permanently if needed, Judge Whitmore leaned forward and spoke words that Malik had almost given up hope of hearing. "All charges against Malik Johnson are hereby vacated," he said, his voice thick but firm. "This court recognizes a grievous miscarriage of justice has occurred and moves for immediate investigation and prosecution of all involved parties." Around the courtroom, gasps echoed like the final crumbling of a dam. Malik staggered slightly, catching himself against the defense table, feeling the world tilt wildly on its axis. He had been exonerated, not just declared innocent, but vindicated. The walls of lies collapsing under the weight of the truth the girl had brought him, the truth her father had died to protect. But even as the courtroom erupted into chaos anew, reporters scrambling to broadcast the scandal, spectacles rushing to arrest Malik's eyes, sought only one thing. He turned and sprinted from the room, ignoring the cries behind him, racing for the ambulance where Rex still fought his silent war for survival, because freedom meant nothing if his brother didn't live to share it with him. The hospital corridors stretched endlessly before Malik as he sprinted through the sterile light, every step pounding with a desperate rhythm. Doors blurred past him, voices shouted indistinct warnings, but he heard nothing except the thundering pulse in his ears. He reached the critical care unit and burst through the doors without waiting for permission. startling the cluster of nurses gathered around Rex's bed. The German Shepherd lay motionless against the crisp white sheets, his side heavily bandaged, an IV line snaking from his paw. Malik staggered to a halt beside him, chest heaving, throat raw. "I'm here, buddy," he whispered, reaching out a trembling hand to rest gently against Rex's massive head. The dog's one good eye cracked open at the touch, cloudy but recognizing. Malik choked on a broken laugh as Rex's tail thumped weakly once against the mattress, a sound so small yet so colossal in its meaning that it broke the last dam holding back Malik. The doctors gave them space, murmuring about miracles and slim chances, about hearing loss and trauma and permanent damage. But Malik only half listened, his entire being focused on the faint rise and fall of Rex's battered chest. Hours bled into one another, day into night, and somewhere amidst it all Malik signed papers, gave statements, sat through interviews, but never once left Rex's side. Not until days later, when the official ceremonies began, when the world that had once turned its back on him now clamored to claim him as their champion. They awarded Malik his freedom in a public ceremony under the scorching Charleston sun. The same politicians who had whispered against him now pinned medals to his chest and spoke solemn words about justice and honor and redemption. Malik accepted them all in silence, his expression carved from stone, his real focus only on the battered dog sitting proudly at his side, a wide leather collar around his thick neck bearing the gold-embossed words, "National Hero." A standing ovation erupting from the crowd as Malik led him onto the platform. Cameras flashing, children waving little flags, veterans saluting. But Malik saw none of it, cared for none of it, his hand resting steadily against Rex's broad shoulders, anchoring them both through the whirlwind. But victories came at a price, and when the applause died away and the crowds dispersed, Malik learned the full measure of what they had lost. Rex, though alive, had sustained irreversible damage to his hearing during the chaos of the courthouse blackout. And gunfire, the doctors explained it gently, as if softening the blow would somehow make it less cruel. Malik listened without interrupting, his hand never leaving Rex's fur, understanding every word and yet refusing to accept that his partner, the most vigilant, most responsive canine he had ever known, would never again hear the sound of his voice. The whistle of command. The world had gone silent for Rex. But somehow the bond between them had not. When Malik crouched before him, mouthing words without sound, Rex still responded, still leaned into him, still knew him, because true loyalty was not built on words but on something deeper, something that defied loss and pain and even silence. The settlement from the city came months later, a fat check they handed over with the same sheepish regret they had once reserved for public scandal. Malik took it without ceremony and immediately put it toward something real, something lasting. A promise born in the darkest hours of his captivity. He bought a stretch of land just outside Charleston, a place thick with trees and open fields. And there he built a sanctuary, a training center not for police dogs or military tools, but for companions, guardians, partners. A place where no leash was a chain and no command was a weapon. He called it Second Light because for him and for Rex, the second light had come after the longest, deepest darkness. People came from all over, some with broken dogs, some with broken hearts, and Malik taught them the way Rex had taught him. Patience, steady, fierce. Rex roamed the grounds with him, a silent sentinel teaching with his body what words could no longer convey. And slowly, the land filled with life and laughter and second chances. A year after the trial, on a warm spring morning thick with the scent of magnolia, Malik stood at the edge of the training field, watching a litter of pups tumble clumsily over each other under the watchful eye of their handlers. And among them was one pup that moved differently, a young German Shepherd with fur just a shade darker than Rex's sharp eyes, and a gait that spoke of strength not yet realized. Malik whistled softly, not that Rex could hear, but the old dog lifted his head anyway, sensing the shift in Malik's posture, and together they watched as the pup trotted toward them, ears pricked, tail high, fearless. Malik crouched down as the pup barreled into his arms, laughing as sharp little teeth nipped playfully at his fingers. He ruffled the pup's ears, feeling the bright, eager heart pounding beneath the soft fur. "Welcome home, Rex 2, he murmured, the words heavy with meaning. The old Rex stepped forward stiffly and sniffed the pup, who responded by licking his scarred muzzle with reckless affection. Malik felt something loosen inside him, a knot of grief and guilt he hadn't realized he still carried, easing under the soft, clumsy touch of new life. The sun climbed higher, gilding the fields in molten light. Malik rose slowly, cradling the pup in one arm while resting his other hand on Rex's broad back. The three of them standing together at the threshold of something vast and unfinished. A new chapter, a new fight, but this time on their own terms, with no lies to bind them, no betrayals to fear. And as Malik looked out across the rolling hills of Second Light, he knew with bone-deep certainty that the truth they had bled for would never be buried again. Not while he still had breath in his body. Not while loyalty still beat in a dog's silent heart. And with that vow burning bright inside him, Malik turned toward the open field, Rex at his side, Rex too leaping ahead, and together they stepped into the light. If this story stirred something deep inside you, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay with us for more journeys that cut through darkness into light. Which moment hit you the hardest? Was it when Rex stood between Malik and death, or when the truth finally shattered the lies? Tell us in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. Your voice matters here. Let's keep this story alive together,